The phone rang, and Linda didn't let it ring twice. Not because she wanted to talk, because she was scared of what silence might mean. Her voice stayed steady, but inside, everything shook. She asked the same thing she'd asked before, the thing that sounded too dramatic to say out loud, the thing that made people pause on the other end of the line. "Please," she said, "go check on him. Right now, just make sure he's breathing." That's the part most people don't connect to loving someone like Elvis Presley. The world thinks the danger is out there, fans, cameras, gossip, headlines. But for the people closest to him, the danger can start to feel like it lives inside the night. Inside the hours when the music stops and the lights go out, and the king is just a tired man staring at a ceiling he can't escape. And what Linda Thompson says now, decades later, in the quiet honesty of her mid-70s, is that the toughest battle Elvis ever fought wasn't a rival or a scandal or even the pressure of being famous. It was the war he fought in private when nobody was applauding. Because here's the open secret, Linda wasn't calling to be dramatic. She was calling because she had heard his nights. She had seen what his mornings looked like. She had watched the way a human body can keep moving while the inside of it is fraying. She had listened to him try to laugh it off. She had watched the people around him normalize things that should have terrified them. And she had felt that specific kind of dread you only feel when someone you love starts slipping away. And you can't tell if they're slipping because they're falling or because they've stopped reaching for the railing. That phone call didn't come out of nowhere. It came from years of midnight fear. Linda has described nights inside Graceland when Elvis would wake up panicked, trapped in an exhaustion so deep it seemed to swallow him. Nights when he couldn't sleep, couldn't calm down, couldn't outrun whatever was tightening in his chest. And Linda, young, in love, trying to be strong, would do the only thing she knew how to do. She would hold him, she would talk to him. Sometimes she would pray out loud, not for the next show, but for peace, for rest, for one quiet night where nothing hunted him. And if you're listening right now thinking, but Elvis had everything, that's exactly why this hurts. Because the story we all grew up with makes Elvis sound untouchable. The voice, the swagger, the lights, the legend. But Linda's story pulls the curtain back and shows you the other side. The side where a man can be adored by millions and still feel lonely in a crowded room. The side where the nickname he gives his girlfriend isn't romantic, it's revealing. By her account, Elvis sometimes called Linda Mommy. Not as a joke, not as some cute thing for the cameras, but as a signal that he wanted comfort, stability, someone to make him feel safe inside his own life, someone who could talk him down when everything in him wanted to spiral. And that's hard to hear because it flips the power dynamic in your mind. It turns the king into a child for a second, not childish, hurt, not weak, overwhelmed. It tells you the toughest battle wasn't the world outside Graceland. It was the world inside his head. Now, Linda could have sold that story 1,000 times over. She could have talked, she could have cashed in, she could have fed the appetite of an audience that always wants one more secret, one more detail, one more reason to feel like they were there. But she didn't, not for a long time. And that silence has weight. Because when someone stays quiet for decades, it isn't always because they have nothing to say. Sometimes it's because what they have to say feels like it belongs to the dead. Sometimes it's because telling it makes it real in a way you can't take back. Sometimes it's because you're still trying to protect the person you couldn't save. Even after she and Elvis were no longer together, she says he still reached for her in moments of vulnerability. He told her she was the only one who truly cared. And imagine what that does to you, carrying that sentence around like a weight you can't set down. Because if you're the one who truly cared, then you also become the one who wonders what you should have done differently. So when Linda says toughest battle, she's not selling a dramatic phrase. She's pointing at sleepless nights that stacked up until they became normal. She's pointing at dependence that settled into the house like another person. She's pointing at a kind of pain that didn't show on stage. There were daytime moments too, the kind that looked harmless if you didn't know. a laugh that came a second too late, a pause before he stood up, a room full of people acting cheerful because namming the truth would change everything. And Linda realized, in that world, comfort came fast and real help came slow for him. And she's pointing at a truth fans don't like to sit with. Love can keep you close to someone and still not be enough to pull them out of the dark. That's why her final phone call hits like it does. Because it wasn't just a phone call, it was a last attempt to interrupt the inevitable, a last attempt to force reality to show itself before it became a headline. By Linda's account, she reached out repeatedly to someone in Elvis's inner circle, asking them to check on him. She wasn't asking for a favor, she was asking for proof of life. She needed someone to tell her with certainty that Elvis was awake, breathing, okay, because her body was screaming the opposite. And what came back was reassurance. He's fine. He's okay. He's asleep. And Linda didn't feel better. Because when you've lived through enough nights with someone, you learn the difference between ordinary sleep and the kind of sleep that scares you. You learn to hear danger in the pauses. You learn to sense when the air is wrong. Then, days later, the call came. Not from a manager, not from a doctor, not from a headline. From a daughter. Linda, Lisa Marie said, and even if you've never lost someone famous, you know that tone. The child voice inside an adult voice. The sound of a world ending. My daddy is dead. That sentence is not a plot twist, it's a collapse. And for Linda, it didn't just collapse the future. It collapsed the past too, because suddenly, every nightmare night, every panicked breath, every prayer in the dark, suddenly it all connects. Suddenly, you realize the battle wasn't a moment. It was a long, quiet war. So why speak now? Because time doesn't erase grief. It changes its texture. It turns sharp pain into a dull ache you carry like weather in your bones. Some days you can ignore it. Some days it starts talking again. Linda eventually decided to speak in a way that wasn't cheap. Not to shame him, not to turn him into a punchline, but to tell the human story behind the poster. Elvis Presley wasn't just a voice and a jumpsuit. He was a man, complicated, tender, funny, wounded. A man who could light up a room and then go quiet when the room emptied out. And Linda Thompson, one of the few people who knew him away from the microphones, says the world never truly understood what he was fighting. So in this story, we're not chasing gossip. We are chasing the truth of what it costs to be beloved by millions and still feel unsafe inside yourself. We're looking at the private Elvis, the one who needed comfort, the one who couldn't always sleep, the one who leaned on the wrong things for relief because relief felt like the only way to survive. And we're looking at Linda, too. Because her story is just, I dated Elvis. Her story is, I loved someone whose pain was bigger than the myth. And that love changes you. It pulls you close. It gives you moments that feel like magic. And then, slowly, it asks you to trade pieces of yourself to keep the other person upright. Linda has admitted that over time, her own dreams and identity started to fade as she became more of a caretaker than a partner. That is not a glamorous confession. It's a hard one, the kind of truth people only say when they're done pretending. And that's why her voice matters now. Because the story of Elvis's last years is often told like a tabloid timeline, tour dates, rumors, numbers. Linda tells it like a house at night. Like a man waking up afraid. Like a young woman trying to be strong enough for two people. Like a love that felt sacred and heavy. So let me take you back, not to the arenas, not to the screaming fans, not to the gold records. Back to a night when a 22-year-old woman walked into a rented-out movie theater in Memphis, expecting nothing more than a film, and stepped into the orbit of a man who would change her life forever. And what happened after that would eventually lead to the phone call Linda still hears in her mind when the world gets too quiet. It started the way so many Elvis stories do, late at night, when normal rules don't apply. A rented-out movie theater in Memphis. A small circle of people. A man everyone thinks they know, sitting in the dark like he's trying to disappear. Linda Thompson was only 22, young enough to still believe life follows clean lines. Meet someone, fall in love, build something. She didn't walk into that theater looking for history. She walked in expecting a movie. And then Elvis Presley turned his head. Not with the stage smile, not with the king energy, with something quieter, a look that felt less like flirting and more like relief. Because that's the part people forget. Elvis didn't just collect attention, he survived it. And by the early 70s, attention had started to feel heavy, like a coat he couldn't take off. Linda later described him there as subdued, almost tired. Not bored, worn down. The kind of worn down that comes from always being on, always being watched, always being expected to sparkle on command. And still, in the dark, he noticed her. He didn't rush her, he didn't perform. He made space for her close to him, like he was creating a tiny corner of normal in a life that had almost none. That first night, the conversation didn't feel like a celebrity picking a girl. It felt like two people trading small truths in a place where nobody was supposed to hear them. Elvis talked about loneliness. Not the kind you can fix with a party, the kind you feel even when the room is full. Linda talked too about her own life, her own fears, the tender parts you don't show in public, and something shifted between them, not fireworks. Recognition. Because when a man has been worshipped for most of his life, he stops trusting applause. He starts trusting whoever sees him when he's quiet. By the time she left, she didn't just have a memory. She had an invitation. Graceland. And that name, it carries a spell. For the outside world, Graceland is a shrine, a place with velvet ropes and camera flashes and tourists who whisper like they're in a church. But for Linda, it became something else. A house with its own gravity. A house that kept people close and made leaving feel like betrayal. At first, it felt like a dream. The late nights, the music playing when it was too late for normal people, friends floating through rooms like time didn't matter, Elvis laughing, Elvis teasing, Elvis suddenly boyish behind the legend. And then the dream showed its teeth. Because under the comfort, there was structure. People around him created a bubble. They protected him. They managed him. They smoothed out the rough edges so the public never saw the seams. And Linda realized quickly, in that bubble, Elvis carried everything, his fame, his expectations, his past, his pain, and everyone else learned to orbit it. Even her. At first, she told herself it was romance, that he loved her attention, her softness, her presence in his storm. But the longer she stayed, the more she understood that love wasn't the only thing keeping her there. Need was there too. Not the needy kind that feels flattering, the kind that feels like responsibility. It showed up in small moments. Elvis would go quiet in the middle of laughter, like his mind drifted somewhere darker. He would stare at nothing like he was listening to a sound nobody else could hear. And then the nights started. The nights where sleep didn't come easily. The nights where he'd wake up panicked, as if his body forgot it was safe, his breathing fast, his voice strained, his eyes wide like a man cornered. Linda didn't announce it to anyone. She didn't take notes. She didn't think, this will matter later. She just did what people do when they love someone who is suffering. She stayed awake. She held him. She spoke softly. Sometimes she prayed out loud, because prayer was the only thing she could offer that didn't require permission from the people who ran his world. And if you're wondering why this matters, why this isn't just another Elvis relationship story, it's because this is the beginning of the battle Linda says nobody wanted to name. The battle wasn't only physical. It was emotional. It was spiritual. It was the pressure of being Elvis Presley every minute of every day until you don't know where the costume ends and the man begins. Linda saw the softness in him that most fans only imagined. She saw a man who wanted to be cared for, not celebrated. A man who wanted a home that felt safe, not famous. A man who could command a stadium and still fear a quiet room. And she saw something else, too, something she didn't have language for at first. Relief was always the goal inside Graceland. Anything that made Elvis feel better fast became normal. A drink, a joke, a new distraction, a late-night snack, a pill to calm down, a pill to sleep, a pill to wake up, a pill to take the edge off a body that never stopped running. Even if nobody called it a problem out loud, Linda could feel it turning into a system. Because dependence doesn't start with a dramatic collapse. It starts with tiny concessions. Just this once. Just tonight. He deserves it. He needs it. And Linda loved him enough to believe it. Then she started noticing the repetition, the patterns, the way the once turned into routine. And the hardest part wasn't even what she saw. It was what she felt. Because when you're inside that kind of love, you don't stand at a distance and judge. You get pulled in. You start measuring days by moods. You start tracking sleep like it's a heartbeat. You start editing yourself, your voice, your emotions, your needs, because the wrong tone might send him spiraling. That's how Graceland changed for her. It was still beautiful, still surreal, still full of moments that felt like fate. But there was a growing shadow in the corners. And Linda could sense it, even when everyone else acted like everything was fine. She was the one close enough to hear the fear in his breath. Close enough to see the exhaustion behind his eyes. Close enough to recognize that Elvis didn't just struggle against the world. He struggled against the night. And soon, Linda would realize something that terrified her more than any headline ever could. Because loving Elvis was not like loving a normal man. It was like holding onto someone with one hand while their pain pulled them underwater with the other. And once she truly understood that, the question was, will this get harder? The question became, how much of herself would she lose trying to keep him safe? At first, Linda didn't call it caretaking. She called it being loyal. She told herself this is what you do when someone you love is tired. You adjust, you support, you don't make it about you. But loyalty has a way of quietly changing its name. It becomes duty. Then it becomes routine. Then one day you wake up and realize you have been living inside someone else's emergency for so long, you don't remember what calm feels like. Elvis's world moved at strange hours. Sleep came late if it came at all. The days blurred, the nights stretched. And in that rhythm, Linda became the person who stayed steady when he couldn't. He would reach for her voice the way a drowning person reaches for air. Sometimes it wasn't even dramatic. Just a tone shift. A heaviness. A quiet desperation in a man trying to hide it. And then there were the moments that revealed too much. The nickname, Mommy. When Elvis said it, it wasn't meant for the outside world. It wasn't cute. It wasn't playful. It was a confession without words. A man with all the power in the world still wanted someone to make him feel safe like a child. And that one word rewired everything for Linda. Because girlfriends get to be chosen. Caretakers get to be needed. And once someone needs you in that way, love stops feeling like freedom. It starts feeling like a contract nobody signed. Linda had her own dreams, her own life. She wasn't born to be a permanent blanket for another person's sorrow. But it's hard to walk away when the person says things that make you feel like leaving could be fatal. And Elvis had a way of saying things that landed inside her like a bruise. He would talk about loneliness like it was a room he couldn't exit. He would be tender and then suddenly closed off. He would make her feel adored, and then make her feel small, because the world demanded so much from him that there wasn't always room for her needs. That's the part fans rarely want to admit. The king could be sweet, but the king could also be swallowed by himself. And when that happened, everyone around him adapted. They didn't confront the darkness. They decorated it. They kept the house moving, kept the jokes going, kept the energy up, because naming the real problem would force them to act, and action might break the fragile balance holding everything together. Linda didn't have that luxury. She was too close to the truth. She saw how quickly relief became the priority, how sleep became a negotiation, how calm came from whatever worked fastest, how the body started to look like it was carrying invisible weight. And she felt the quiet terror of realizing that Elvis was not simply tired. He was worn thin. And that kind of exhaustion makes people reach for anything. The relationship started to change shape. There were still beautiful moments, private laughter, tenderness, a touch that felt like home. But those moments had a shadow now, because Linda could feel herself disappearing. Not all at once, in small sacrifices. She would swallow her frustration because he was fragile. She would silence her needs because he was suffering. She would make herself smaller so he didn't feel cornered by guilt. And then jealousy crept in, not just jealousy of other women or other attention. Jealousy of the very thing she couldn't compete with. Whatever Elvis used to numb himself had a grip she could not replace with love. That creates a specific kind of heartbreak. The kind where you start arguing with yourself in your own head. If I'm kinder, he'll sleep. If I stay calmer, he'll stop spiraling. If I love harder, he'll stop reaching for relief in the wrong places. But love doesn't work like that. Linda learned that the hard way. Because some nights, she would do everything right and still lose. She would talk softly and he'd still pace. She would hold his hand and he'd still look far away. She would pray and he'd still wake up in fear. And after enough nights like that, a terrifying thought starts creeping in. What if I can't help him? Not because I don't love him, but because the battle isn't mine to fight. That's when the relationship stopped feeling like a romance and started feeling like a storm shelter. Linda stayed because she cared. She stayed because leaving felt cruel. She stayed because when someone looks you in the eyes like you're the only safe thing in their world, walking away feels like dropping them. But time passes, pressure builds, and even the strongest person reaches a breaking point. Linda eventually found herself staring at a future that scared her. A future where her entire life becomes managing Elvis's pain. A future where she's always on alert. Always listening for the sound of panic. Always checking whether he's sleeping or slipping. And in moments of quiet honesty, she realized something that made her feel ashamed and relieved at the same time. She wanted her own life back. Not because she stopped loving him, but because she was vanishing beside him. That kind of truth hurts because it feels selfish. But it can also be survival. So the tension became unbearable. Stay and risk drowning with him. Leave and live with the fear of what might happen when you're not there to steady him. And when she finally chose herself, when she finally stepped out of that orbit, Elvis didn't respond like a man losing a girlfriend. He responded like a man losing his last piece of safety. He said words that stayed lodged inside her for years. That she was the only one who truly cared. Think about what that does to a person. It turns love into guilt. It turns memory into responsibility. It turns distance into panic. Because now, even from afar, Linda couldn't fully relax. She could still hear the insomnia in his voice. Still feel the darkness around the edges. Still sense the fragile balance that could crack at any moment. And that's why later, when something in her gut told her the air had changed, she didn't ignore it. She reached out. She asked someone close to him to check on him. Not once, more than once, because Linda wasn't trying to control him anymore. She was trying to protect him from the worst version of the night. And there's a reason she used the most haunting phrase possible. Please make sure he's breathing. Because when you've lived with someone's private battle, you stop trusting reassurance. You start trusting instincts. And Linda's instincts were screaming. Something was wrong. Something was coming. And the next call she would receive would not sound like a normal call. It would sound like a door slamming shut on an era and on a love she never truly stopped carrying. The first time Linda felt the end coming, it wasn't a headline or a siren. It was a feeling in her chest that wouldn't unclench. A quiet alarm that returned in waves, even when she tried to talk herself out of it. By then, she and Elvis were no longer living the same daily life. Not the Graceland rhythm, not the late-night conversations, not the fragile routines that used to keep him from falling too far into the dark. But distance didn't cut the cord, it tightened it, because now she had no way to see him with her own eyes. All she had were phone calls, shorter, rarer, and somehow more urgent. When Elvis reached out, it wasn't to brag about a show or a new song. It was to touch something familiar. He sounded worn down, like every sentence cost effort. And when he spoke about her, it carried that painful softness that makes you freeze because you can't tell if it's love or desperation. He told her she was the only one who truly cared. Linda didn't hear a compliment. She heard a confession, a man surrounded by people, still feeling alone. And even though she had left to save herself, those words dragged her back emotionally, like a hand on the wrist. After that, she started calling around, not out of drama, out of fear. She contacted someone close to Elvis, someone who could get behind the closed doors. Linda asked for a simple thing, and she asked it again and again, because simple things become precious when you're scared. Go check on him, please. Make sure he's breathing. The answer she got back was always some version of the same reassurance. He's okay, he's fine, he's sleeping. Sometimes it came with a tone that implied she was worrying too much. Sometimes it came gently, like they understood her fear but didn't share it, and that made her anxiety worse. Because when everyone around a crisis acts calm, you start wondering if you're crazy or if they're numb. In the quiet moments, she remembered the other Elvis, not the one in sequins, the one who woke up terrified in the middle of the night, the one who couldn't sleep, who couldn't settle, who needed her voice like a lifeline, the one who would grab at anything that promised a few hours of relief, because relief felt like oxygen. She wondered how many nights he was awake now, how many times someone said he's just tired, while ignoring the way tiredness was eating him from the inside. And then came the call that didn't sound like anything else. Not the familiar ring that gives you time to brace yourself. This one landed like a stone in still water. Lisa Marie's voice was on the other end, a child's voice trapped in a grown woman's throat, the kind of sound that makes you sit down without thinking. My daddy is dead. Linda felt the room tilt, not in a poetic way, in a physical way, like her body was trying to reject the words. For a few seconds, she didn't have language, just shock. Then the guilt arrived. Not because she caused anything, but because love always rewrites the past when tragedy happens. Her mind started ripping open old scenes like they were evidence. Nights she stayed, nights she left, conversations she replayed. The last time she heard his voice. The last time she accepted he's fine when her instincts screamed no. In that moment, the title Elvis Presley disappeared. All that remained was a man she had loved and a little girl who had just lost her father. She asked what happened, even though her heart already knew. The answer came in broken fragments, mumbled logistics, people rushing, the word gone said too plainly. Linda listened, and each fragment felt like a nail sealing something shut. After she hung up, the phone kept ringing. Friends, acquaintances, people who hadn't spoken to her in months suddenly wanted confirmation, wanted to be first. The television made it worse. His name crawling across the screen, anchors speaking in that careful voice. Linda cried, and it wasn't the tidy kind. It knocked the air out of her. Realizing your worst fear was accurate doesn't bring comfort, it brings emptiness. She didn't want the world's version. She wanted one more private second, one more chance to rewind time back to the moment she said, check on him, and force someone to take her fear seriously. But time doesn't rewind. It only asks what you'll do with what's left. Later, when the noise finally quieted, Linda replayed his last words like a hymn that still hurt. The way he said her name, the pause before he confessed he felt alone. She kept thinking, if he could say that out loud, how much worse was the part he never said. Her phone call hadn't saved him, but it proved something she would carry for years. She wasn't imagining the danger. She had been hearing the truth in the silence. And now that silence had swallowed him whole. Grief didn't arrive for Linda like a clean wave. It arrived like a crowd. Before she could even understand what had happened, the world rushed in to claim it. Phones, voices, questions spoken too fast. Elvis's death wasn't treated like a private tragedy. It was treated like an event. Someone, somewhere, was already shaping the first headline while Linda was still trying to breathe. In the hours after that call, she moved through simple actions like they belonged to another person. She stared at ordinary objects and couldn't remember why they mattered, and her mind kept snapping back to one sharp thought that cut through every attempt at comfort. I knew. Not I knew, like a prediction you're proud of. I knew like a curse. Because she had felt that dread in her chest, she had begged people in his circle to check on him. She had asked for proof of life. And now that instinct stood there like a witness, dragging her toward the most brutal question imaginable. If you knew, why didn't you do more? That question doesn't care about logic. It doesn't care that you can't control another person's body or their choices or the fragile machinery around them. It just repeats until it starts sounding like truth. Linda carried it while the public mourned a symbol. She understood why fans felt shattered. Elvis wasn't just a singer to them, he was memory, comfort, identity. But Linda's grief lived in a different room. She wasn't mourning the jumpsuit or the legend. She was mourning the private Elvis, the one who couldn't sleep, the one who woke up afraid, the one who reached for calm like it was oxygen. And that's when the pressure began. People wanted her to speak. They wanted the inside story, the clean narrative, the shocking line that would make the loss feel consumable. The machine was hungry, and grief is one of its favorite fuels. Linda could have stepped into that spotlight and been applauded for telling the truth. She could have cashed in on her proximity, but she didn't, because she could already feel what would happen if she did. His private pain would become entertainment, and she would become a character in someone else's version of him. So she chose silence, not emptiness, silence with intention. And that choice cost her too, because when you stay quiet, other people fill the blanks. Rumors grow teeth. Strangers speak with confidence, as if confidence is evidence. The story gets simplified until it loses its humanity. The man becomes either a saint or a punchline, and both are wrong. Linda watched it happen and swallowed her anger because she had made a promise to herself. She would not trade his vulnerability for attention. Still, she couldn't outrun the complicated grief. She grieved him, but she also grieved herself, the young woman who tried to be strong enough for two people. She remembered the tenderness, and she remembered the helplessness. She felt pride for surviving, shame for feeling relief at times, longing for the good moments, jealousy of anything that gave him comfort faster than love did. That's an ugly grief in the honest sense. It doesn't come neatly packaged. Years passed and Elvis stayed everywhere, on radio, on posters, on documentaries, on people's lips. And every time the public version of him got replayed, Linda felt the private version flare alive inside her, like a bruise you keep bumping. Sometimes she'd catch a song in the wrong moment, and suddenly she was back in a dark house at night, listening to fear in his breathing. Sometimes she'd remember that sentence he gave her, telling her she was the only one who truly cared, and guilt would spike, sharp and undeserved. Because if you truly cared, you start wondering why caring wasn't enough. But time can do something gentle when it's done punishing you. It can turn guilt into clarity. It can teach you that love is real and limits are real too, that you can't outlove someone's toughest battle. You can only stand beside them, and sometimes even that isn't enough to keep the ending away. Linda began to understand her silence wasn't cowardice. It was devotion. It was restraint. It was her way of refusing to use a dead man's pain as a ladder. And then, slowly, she reached the other truth. Silence protects, but it can also erase. If she never spoke, the world would keep worshipping the mask and forgetting the man underneath. If she never spoke, people would keep misunderstanding the kind of battle Elvis fought when the lights went out. So one day, Linda chose a different kind of protection. She decided to tell the story carefully. Not the tabloid truth, the human truth. And when she finally opened that door she'd kept shut for decades, she realized something that startled her. Telling it wouldn't only change how people saw Elvis. It would finally explain what she had been carrying all along. Because the next question was what happened to him. It was what she would reveal about the nights at Graceland she never forgot. Grief changes shape when the world refuses to let a person stay private. For Linda, the years after Elvis didn't move forward in a straight line. They circled. A song would play in a random store, and suddenly she'd be back in a dark house, listening for the moment his breathing changed. A photograph would surface, and the memories would arrive with it, sweet at first, then sharp. People acted like time should have made it easier, but time did something stranger. It made the noise louder. Because Elvis never really left. He became a brand, a debate, a costume people wore on stage. He became a story told by people who weren't there. And every version of him that floated through the years seemed to come with the same problem. It flattened him into one thing, either a perfect legend or a tragic cautionary tale, either a god or a punchline. Linda didn't recognize either. The Elvis she knew could be tender in a way that almost hurt to remember. He could be funny, playful, silly, like a boy who never got to be ordinary for long. And then, without warning, he could turn inward, as if a door closed behind his eyes. That's where his toughest battle lived. Not in the spotlight, in the quiet. It's hard to explain that to people who only knew him through music. Fans remember the power, how he made them feel alive, how his voice felt like home. Linda understood that love. She respected it. But she also wanted people to understand something deeper. A man can be adored and still feel unsafe in his own mind. Fame can amplify loneliness until it becomes its own kind of prison. The same world that worships you can slowly erase you. And if you're asking why she didn't say all of this sooner, the honest answer is that telling the truth comes with a cost. When you speak, you don't just share memories, you invite judgment. You invite strangers to pick apart your choices and your timing. Linda knew that if she talked, she would be turned into a headline too, another accessory in the Elvis story. So she protected the story the only way she could. She held it. And now, at 75, she speaks with the calm of someone who has buried the chaos and kept the love. Her age isn't a headline. It's proof she outlived the noise and still chose to tell the truth with tenderness. But carrying something for decades changes you. It isn't only silence, it's weight. It's learning to smile when people bring up Elvis while your mind flashes to the nights nobody romanticizes. It's watching the public mourn the idea of him while you mourn the man who couldn't sleep. Then, a different kind of realization arrives. Silence might protect the person you loved, but it can also protect the misunderstanding that keeps repeating. It can let the world keep telling the story wrong. Linda eventually chose to speak in a way that wasn't loud but intentional, not a chaotic tell-all, a careful opening of the door, a chance to say, this is what it was like, without turning his private suffering into a circus. Because her version of Elvis insists on something the world often resists: empathy. Not excuses, empathy. Empathy lets you see that someone's worst coping mechanism may have been built out of desperation, that someone's public strength may have been covering private fear, that pain doesn't disappear because you're successful. Sometimes it grows in the shadows of success. And Linda also had to make peace with the part of the story that centered her. Loving someone with a private war changes the lover too. It builds pride and guilt in the same hour. It creates jealousy you're ashamed of. It makes you swallow anger because you don't want to push them deeper. It makes you feel selfish for needing rest. And it leaves you with a grief that isn't only about losing them, it's about losing the version of yourself you were before their battle entered your life. When Linda speaks today, it isn't just to reframe Elvis. It's to reclaim herself. To say she wasn't a date on a timeline, she was a witness. She heard the fear. She carried the dread. She tried, in her own human way, to hold steady when everything felt unstable. And for fans, this changes the legacy in a quiet but powerful way. Because if you can hear Elvis as a human being, you stop demanding perfection from his story. You stop treating the ending like entertainment. You stop hunting for villains in a tragedy that was bigger than any one person. You start holding the hard truth. Sometimes the toughest battle is invisible, and love alone can't always win it. Which leaves one last question hanging in the air, one Linda has lived with for years. If you had been close enough to see the battle behind the legend, would you have told the world? Or would you have protected him, even if it meant carrying the weight in silence? There's a moment in every legacy story when the audience wants a clean ending. A final lesson, a neat moral, a bow tied around the pain. But Linda's truth doesn't come with a bow. Because the last thing she wants is for Elvis's toughest battle to be reduced to a cliché. She doesn't want him turned into a warning sign people point at from a safe distance. And she doesn't want him embalmed as a flawless icon either. Both versions keep him out of reach. Both versions let us avoid the uncomfortable middle. The middle is where the real story lives. A man who could make a room feel electric and still go quiet when the room emptied. A man who could give millions of people comfort and still struggle to give it to himself. A man who could be generous, funny, tender, and still wake up at night with fear tightening around his chest. And a woman who loved him enough to stay, then loved herself enough to leave, and spent years trying to forgive herself for needing to survive. If you listen closely, that's what her voice carries now: survival. Not bitterness, not revenge, survival. Linda didn't finally speak out because she wanted attention. She spoke because time gave her permission to tell the story like a human story, not a tabloid one. Because when people love Elvis, they deserve to love the truth too, the messy truth. The kind that doesn't make you love him less, but makes you love him more honestly. And maybe this is the hardest part of all. When a legend dies, the world keeps taking. It takes clips, it takes photos, it takes quotes, it takes pieces until a person becomes content. Linda's choice to speak carefully is her way of giving something back without letting the world consume him again. She's saying, remember the music, but don't forget the man. Remember the glory, but don't erase the nights. Remember the performance, but don't ignore the battle. Because if we ignore it, we repeat it on someone else in a different era with different headlines. And there's one image that keeps returning in Linda's story, whether she names it directly or not. A phone pressed to her ear, her voice trying not to crack, her asking another adult to do the simplest, most terrifying thing. Go look at him. Make sure he's breathing, even when your gut says otherwise. That isn't celebrity drama. That's love at the edge of panic. That's what happens when you've seen behind the curtain long enough to recognize when the air has changed. So when you hear Linda now, at 75, you're not just hearing an old romance brought back to life. You're hearing a woman finally putting language to the things she lived through, what it feels like to be close to someone the world thinks is invincible, while you watch them fight a war in the dark. And the truth is, there's still a part of this story she can't fully give away. Not because she's hiding, because some memories don't belong to the public. Some moments were sacred, even in their sadness. Some details would feel like stealing from a grave. So she gives us what she can. Enough to understand, enough to feel, enough to stop treating his last years like a spectacle. And she leaves the rest where it belongs, between two people who once sat in the dark of a Memphis theater, talking like ordinary souls for a few fragile hours. Hear what I want you to sit with as we close. Elvis wasn't defeated by a single moment. He was worn down by a long, private battle, one that looked invisible from the stage. And Linda's story isn't about blame. It's about compassion. It's about seeing the human being inside the myth. Because maybe that's the only way a legacy becomes something more than nostalgia. Maybe the real tribute is refusing to look away from the truth. So if you're still here with me, don't let this end as background noise. Hold it like you'd hold a friend's confession. Think about the people you've loved who seemed fine on the surface. Think about the ones who smiled in public and unraveled at night. Think about how easy it is to miss the warning signs when the person is talented, famous, funny, charming, when the world keeps rewarding them for looking okay. And in the next story, we're going to follow the thread Linda only hinted at, the moment Elvis let something slip in private that made the people closest to him go quiet, because they realized the battle had crossed a line. If this story hit you in the chest, don't just move on like it was another clip. Tell me this in the comments. When someone you love is struggling in silence, how do you know the moment to step in before it's too late? And if you had been the one getting those late-night calls, would you have stayed quiet to protect them or spoken up to protect their life? I read every word.